U.S. History. We are going to continue talking about the 1950s today, but we're going to be moving into the 1960s throughout the week, and it's a really exciting week because we are talking about the Civil Rights Movement. So today we're going to look at how the movement kind of gets started and some of the long-term causes of the Civil Rights Movement, and then by the end of the week we'll be talking about Martin Luther King Jr. and how segregation ends in the entire country and the Civil Rights Act of 1965. So exciting week. I hope you're ready. Before we can get started talking about our long-term causes of the Civil Rights Movement, we want to remind ourselves, get some context of what race relations looks like in the late 50s, early 60s. And so this should be a review because I feel like we've been talking about this every single lecture in one way or another. But the 1950s is still a time of intense racial segregation, discrimination, you name it. In the 50s, it's been building for decades. And so it's ironic because remember last week we talked about how in the 1950s, Americans are largely focused on creating this like perfect ideal society, especially in the family unit, while they're trying to create this perfect society or this perfect nation. You still have like kind of the hypocrisy of racism and segregation very, very present and very intense throughout the country. And so segregation, it applies to every single area of life, where you live, your job, what facilities you have access to, where you can sit on the bus, where you can sit in church. All of this stuff is segregated. But depending on where you live, it's enforced differently. So even though segregation in those areas applies nationwide, it's not like you can go anywhere and escape segregation. Depending on where you live, it looks different, okay? And so in the West, for instance, you still have widespread segregation and you do have a growing African-American community, especially in the Bay Area. But really segregation applies to Mexican Americans and Asian Americans. The biggest difference though is between the North versus the South. And again, you still have widespread segregation in those areas, but it's enforced differently. So in the South, their type of segregation, we call this de jure segregation. This is segregation by law, meaning there's actual laws throughout the South whether you go to certain cities or states, there's actual written down laws that tell African Americans what they can and cannot do and where they can and cannot live, okay? And these laws, we call them the Jim Crow laws, and they are enforced or kind of upheld by Plessy versus Ferguson, which was that Supreme Court case back in the late 1890s that said that segregation was lawful, that it was constitutional. Ever since then, we've had all of these laws that have been building, these Jim Crow laws, that are governing Southern segregation. Now, in the North, even though you still have segregation, you don't have written down laws like in the South. Like Jim Crow laws aren't a thing in the North like they are in the South, but instead, they enforce their segregation through tradition. So we call this de facto segregation. This would be like, let's say every Thanksgiving, Dad uses the same knife to carve the Thanksgiving turkey. Like every single year he uses the same knife. And then, you come home from college one year and, Dad's getting ready to carve the turkey and he has a different knife, right? Now there's no law that says he has to use that knife, but that's the way it's always been. And so what are you gonna do? You're gonna get upset, right? Like, Dad, where's the knife? This isn't Thanksgiving without that, right? That is de facto segregation in essence. It's the way we've always done things. And so there's real consequences if you break those traditions, even though they're not written down laws, okay? So that's what we see in the North versus the South. But again, it's everywhere. And by the time we get to the 50s, segregation is having real impacts on the African-American society. For instance, they have higher rates of poverty because they don't have access to certain jobs. They have higher rates of illiteracy because their schools aren't being funded or they just don't have schools in their area. There's lower rates of home ownership because most of them are living in urban communities where you don't have widespread home construction like in the suburbs. This is even affecting their life expectancy. So African Americans have lower rates, lower life expectancies in the 50s and early 60s because even like the 911 system, which is a thing, at this time, if you have an emergency and you call 911 and they recognize that as an African-American community, the ambulance isn't coming. They're going to all the white neighborhoods and then coming to yours, okay? And when you get to the hospital, you may not have access to the same doctors, you may not have access to the same treatments or facilities. All of that comes into play. And so you have higher death rates among African-Americans largely because of segregation. So this is having a real impact on these communities. It's not just, where I can live and where I can't live, okay? And so I want to talk for the rest of today just kind of about early causes of the movement. And we've talked about some of these. Some of these, they find their beginning actually in World War II. Remember what was kind of the common argument, what you heard from the African-American community a lot in World War II was, this isn't fair. Like, this is so hypocritical. We're fighting Hitler overseas. We're fighting for freedom overseas. But we have segregation here. Like, our own people don't even have freedom. Those arguments continue in the 50s and the 60s, even though the war is over. But it's because of the Cold War. So it's not Hitler anymore. It's Stalin or the Soviet Union, basically saying, okay, we are fighting communism overseas. We're trying to bring freedom to the world and democracy to the world in the Cold War. But what about freedom here? So again, exposing hypocrisy of American ideals. That's one of the long-term causes. Another long-term cause that we've talked about before, again, in World War II, you have the establishment of the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE, that organization. Remember, they were important because they were the ones that said it's going to be through nonviolent protest, sit-ins, civil disobedience, that we actually end segregation. And so they are gaining momentum, they are gaining membership and getting their message out, spreading this message of nonviolence to their membership. But some of the long-term causes that we haven't talked about. In 1947, Jackie Robinson becomes the first African-American Major League Baseball player. He plays for the Brooklyn Dodgers, and this may not seem like a big deal, but it really is. He kind of serves kind of like the Harlem Renaissance did, like an aspect of culture that's able to bridge the gap between the races. So you have white Americans who are coming out to Dodger games, not just to see the team, but to see Jackie Robinson play because he was really, really good. You also have a Swedish author who comes to the United States. He observes society, and he writes this book called An American Dilemma. He writes it actually back in 1944, but it gets really popular in the 50s. And you read through the book, and it's like, this is terrible. Like, he's talking about how America is super racist and segregation. It's just bad, 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 bad. But then you get to the end of the book, and he's like, I think Americans can overcome this. You have this message of hope at the end, where even though things are terrible right now, American democracy is going to triumph over racism. And so that confidence and that hope, it starts spreading throughout society that, yeah, maybe we can overcome it, even though it's really bad right now, okay? But the most significant long-term cause that we're going to talk about today is by far Brown versus Board of Education, okay? This is important because this is the Supreme Court case that desegregates schools. Remember when we talked about Reconstruction and the beginning of segregation, and I said segregation starts with schools, but what else does it do? It ends with schools. And this is that moment that I was alluding to months and months ago when we did Reconstruction. Basically, you have a group called the NAACP. They start winning all of these court cases. So they start bringing segregation into the court system and trying to fight it legally. And there is an attorney named Thurgood Marshall who's kind of heading up. He's the head attorney on a lot of these different cases. And so they start winning in a lot of these lower courts. And so they start thinking, as they gain confidence, maybe this is the time to challenge segregation in the Supreme Court. And so they take this case, Brown versus Board of Education, where they're basically arguing, according to the Supreme Court, that school segregation isn't fair. Remember Plessy versus Ferguson? Plessy versus Ferguson, it argued, we can have segregation as long as it's fair and equal, right? And so what Thurgood Marshall argues to the Supreme Court, it's that it's anything but fair and equal, which everybody knows, right? So he points to how we don't have access to schools. We don't have access to buses to transport our kids to school. We don't have resources for our teachers. We don't have facilities that work. And so he points to all of these comparisons, and the Supreme Court unanimously decides that he is right, that it isn't fair. And because it's not fair, Plessy versus Ferguson doesn't apply. And so they decide that that schools need to be desegregated, okay? So the significance of this case is that, again, schools need to be desegregated. Now, this is also important because it's not just going to end with schools. It starts with schools, right? We're going to desegregate schools, but then what's going to happen is once it happens, they're going to start chipping away at other parts of society before everything gets desegregated. So it starts the ball rolling desegregating American society at large. Now you can imagine that the South is super upset at this ruling. And so you have a resurgence of the KKK. You have something called the Southern Manifesto in 1956, which basically is a bunch of Southern politicians that say, yeah, we don't care what the Supreme Court says. We're going to keep doing it anyways. And so even though this case says that desegregation needs to start, it's going to be decades before it actually fully happens. But it does start to happen in Arkansas. The very first school that gets desegregated is a school called Central High in Little Rock, Arkansas. And this is in 1957. And you basically have these 9 African-American teenagers, we call them the Little Rock Nine, who are going to start attending Central High, which is a white high school. So again, this is the first time a school is being attempted to desegregate. So you can imagine not only just the media, like how much attention this attracts nationwide. You have all kinds of news crews there. You have people who come from all over the country to witness this event, many of them not happy about it. And so you have widespread mob violence. There's a big threat to these teenagers, so much so that the first time that they try to enter the school, they actually say, nope, we can't do it because we're worried about these teenagers. Their lives are threatened by all of this, by these angry mobs, essentially. And so they have to try again. And the second time, you can see a picture on your PowerPoint, they actually have them escorted in by the National Guard, which is a division of the military. And so these 9 teenagers, they go into Central High accompanied by the National Guard, and those soldiers stay with them throughout the entire school year. So you can imagine like a class of Baran, you're sitting there in your history class, eating your Cheetos, and you look behind you and you got soldiers who are making sure that certain kids in your class are safe. And so just imagine that kind of reality. But again, this is gonna get the ball rolling. And even though it happens very slowly, you do have other schools that start to desegregate after Central High does. Again, that was in 1957. President Eisenhower, he kind of sees how this is moving in this direction. And so he passes something called the Civil Rights Act of 1957, which basically validates, yes, schools do need to desegregate, but he tacks more on there. And he actually says, we also need to work on voting rights, because by the time we get to the 1960s, most African Americans, they're not even registered to vote. Like in Mississippi, only 6% of African Americans are even registered to vote, which you can't even vote until you've been registered. So that first step, they're not even doing, because they've lost complete confidence in the system. The Civil Rights Act of 1957 is basically the government saying, we're working on schools, but we also want to start working on voting as well, okay? So remember how I talked about how CORE was gaining membership and nonviolent protest and activism was kind of the thought of the time of how they were going to end segregation and bring about civil rights. One of the people who kind of test CORE's theory, civil rights and activism, is a lady named Rosa Parks, who, aside from my boy Teddy, is my second favorite historical figure, only above John Brown. So it's Teddy, Rosa Parks, John Brown. I love Rosa Parks because she's incredible. Like December 1st, 1955, she's this little old lady, and she boards a bus in Montgomery, Alabama, super racist city. And she decides, I'm gonna sit in the front. Like, I don't care, I'm not gonna move to the back. I'm gonna sit in the front. And so they ask her to leave. They ask her to move to the back, and she says no, she just refuses to do it. And so they arrest her. And they arrest her for disorderly conduct. She's breaking real laws. Again, de jure segregation. She's breaking a real law, so she gets arrested. Now, her arrest, it sparks all of this buzz in the rest of the city. And so you have thousands of African Americans who decide, you know, we're going to defend her action, and we're going to boycott the buses just for one day. So for one day, no African Americans are going to use the bus system in Montgomery, Alabama. Now, who is using the buses, right? Americans are driving cars, but that's white America. And so African Americans are the ones who are using the buses. And so the fact that they don't use the buses just for one day, the Montgomery bus system loses so much money that they decide to call the thing off, and they win. They basically say, okay, you can sit wherever you want. And so this bus boycott, it inspires confidence in African Americans and basically says, yes, this is it. It's going to be through civil disobedience, nonviolent protests, right? There's no violence involved in any of this. They just decided not to use the bus system for a day, and look at what they were able to accomplish, right? And so the reason why Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott is so important is because, again, it sets that foundation of, we're going to use nonviolent protest, but it also proves that it works, right? Because they see real success because of those nonviolent actions. And so she's the best. If you picked her for your American Hero Project, know that I smiled a ton because you made a really, really good choice. Anyways, I hope you're washing your hands, and I just miss you guys so much. If you need anything, please let me know. Reach out, and we'll talk again soon.